Oh lord, that was the wrong one. Alright, no bigs. Either way, let's get this show on the road. It is June 1st, 2015. Today is Monday. My name is Anthony, otherwise known as Walnut. And today I'm going to be doing a Legacy of the Void build order analysis and essentially strategy analysis for the Protoss race. We're going to be looking at Kiwikaki's 2-gate into Cyber. This is a very interesting build going into Legacy of the Void. It's not really something anybody's thought of, I guess. Now, I want to explain something about Protoss that was very present in Wings of Liberty and Heart of the Swarm. One of the major problems with Protoss in Wings of Liberty was their early game deficit. Now, in the early game, generally, Zerg has like Zerglings, like Speedlings, Roaches, Banelings, that sort of thing to gain early map control and early map advantage. Terran has, of course, Bio, as well as things like Hellions and Banshees, which are a bit less common, especially back in Wings. But those were definitely very important, and they allowed the players to get an early advantage in map control. Fortunately, the same can't be said about Protoss. While there were options to get out on the map early in the game, there weren't a whole lot of them. Gateway armies are generally not as strong, they're generally a lot more fragile, a lot more weak, and they need some sort of AoE backup to help supplement this. And this early game weakness also meant that it was incredibly hard to take an expansion, particularly versus Terran, where things like Forge Fast Expand weren't an option. This is why we saw things like 4-gate versus 4-gate, as it was incredibly difficult to hold by both players. And this is why we saw builds like 3-gate Robo before expand in PvT, simply because it was so dangerous to expand early game against that early map control, those early units, without any sort of AoE or Colossus or meat to the army. Now, this was remedied slightly in Heart of the Swarm with what most people would consider a band-aid fix. What they did was they added the Mothership Core, and this added essentially a photon cannon early to the Protoss race that can't necessarily be killed as easily. And what that did was it allowed Protoss players to do a lot more risky things, a lot more economic builds, without having to invest so much early into the defense because the gateway units were so weak. And what this has turned into is a huge swell in build order diversity. We no longer see only 4-gate PvP. We no longer see only 3-gate Robo in PvT. And you don't have to go Forge Fast Expand in PvZ. Now, mind you, people have been going Forge Fast Expand in PvZ since Brood War. It's been years and years. That was the safest build. It was one of the only options you could really go in PvZ to get an economic advantage early and still transition into the mid-late game. Now, in Heart of the Swarm, in PvT especially, this was a big deal, because going 1-gate expand and being able to go things like Templar or Blink just weren't really options in Wings of Liberty. And with the transition to Heart of the Swarm, it was a very big step forward for not going Colossus all the time in Protoss matchups. But in Legacy of the Void, it gets better. Now, they added in the Adept, which is an incredibly useful early game unit, not only for harass, but holding off those big swells of small units, such as Zerglings or Marines, which generally we didn't have an option for before. If you were to get pushed before 10 minutes with a big swell of Marine Marauder, you had Stalkers and Sentries and Zealots. Mind you, these Zealots don't have charge, your Stalkers are garbage against Marauders, and you have to hit essentially the best force fields in the world to hold off some of those timings. And the Mothership Core, while it did help and it did prevent a lot of these, it still meant that Protoss couldn't move out on the map early, which is a big problem. And it still led to a slight early game deficit. But transitioning into Legacy of the Void, Adepts are a very useful tool, and Kiwikaki noticed something interesting with the economy changes. Now that you start with 12 workers, you can get a gateway at around 14 supply, And before your gateway finishes, you actually have 150 minerals excess, meaning you can throw down an extra structure before your cyber core is finished. That's a big deal. That means you can get twice as many units out, twice as fast. Wow, okay, in the same amount of time. Let's be real here. But this is a very, very big deal, especially adding in the Adept. This allows many, many more things to be done in all of the matchups, actually. And it really allowed for harassment openings. It allowed for very strong gateway timings off of 2 or 3 bases. Lots of really cool stuff. And I want to hop into some replays and show you guys this sort of stuff firsthand. Mind you, all of the replays are from me so far, simply because I don't have enough people I know in Legacy of the Void to be experimenting with these builds for me. So we're going to hop into a replay really quickly. Let me find that one. I believe... Okay, the first one we're going to do is a PvT. Oh lord, I didn't find my PvP replay. Oh, I'm sorry. Anyway, I'll work out that later during the break probably. But the first thing we're going to do is look at a PvT 2-gate fast expand. So I will load into that right now, and we will transition into that. Loading on up. Oh lord. Oh lord. I have the wrong no, I don't have the wrong overlay. I just need to add a thing to it. That should be, there we go. Yeah, that's perfect. So if we look at the production tab, I will outline the build in this portion of it, of the broadcast. So you go a pylon on 13 and start up your 14th probe. Rally your 14th probe out to the pylon, and as soon as that's done, you'll be able to chrono boost out your 15th worker and start a gateway. Now, this is where things start to get interesting. You usually go about a 16 gas, essentially as soon as you can get it, because you're going to need the gas as much as possible going this sort of build. Then, this is the big divergence point. This is the big point where we say, alright, things are going to start working out now in a very different way. You have 2 gateways instead of just 1, and you also have a very strong harass unit. This means that you'll be able to do a lot of damage as long as you micro your way to victory. And this wasn't an option back in Heart of the Swarm. You needed to get your cyber core out as fast as possible so that you could get your stalkers, so you could get your sentries, so you could get your mothership core, so that you could get your warp gate research and eventually go into your robo or your stargate or your twilight council, and that's not necessary anymore. You can go 2 gateways, you can get harassment damage done, you can be active on the map, and that is so important because Protoss normally does not have that option, especially in Heart of the Swarm. Mothership core helps defend early game, but it does not mean you can play more aggressive on the map. Generally, before you get up your 4 or 5 warp gate count, as well as your extra tech structure, that being a robo, a stargate, or a twilight council, you cannot move out on the map. There's simply not enough meat there in your army, not enough upgrades, you don't have blink yet, there's not much you can do to get out on the map. But with 2 adapts in the early game to deal with marines, to deal with reapers, to deal with lings, you have so many options available to you. Now we'll hop back into the replay, continue this build. So we go on here, fully saturate that gas. As soon as this gateway finishes, about 18-19 supply, you throw it on your cyber core. Now, you can chrono boost on 18 supply, but the other 2 you want to save so that you can chrono boost both of your adepts. You don't want to chrono boost after 18 supply. We see standard stuff for the Terran player, but this isn't about the Terran player. Terran player doesn't matter. Right now, it's all about the toss. We want to move out a probe fairly early to get some sort of proxy pylon on the map to scout up a little bit. And here's the real main portion of this. We have 2 adepts started up immediately. This also allows for us to get a fairly early expand, not as early as if we were going for a single gateway, but these 2 adepts, very, very strong units. This also allows for mothership core, another early gas, and then we can move into things like twilight council and early adept shields. Early Adept Shields is very, very important here because look at how, okay, first of all, look at how well Adepts deal with Reapers. It is ridiculous. But in all accounts, what we should be worried about here is the fact that, look at this, I'm able to move out on the map, I'm able to pressure the Terran player, and that's so important. I'm able to macro up behind it, get out my Twilight Council, a few extra gateways, and I'm still doing damage to the Terran player. I'm forcing him back to his own base at 3 minutes into the game. It's ridiculous. It's so good right now. And Early Adept Shields allows me to keep up this 2-base contain that I have going on. Not that he's going for a 3-base right now, but I still have the option. With a bunch of Adepts, with Adept Shield upgrade, as well as Stalkers, Zealots, Sentries, all that sort of good stuff, I'm going to be able to be active on the map. Adepts do a lot of damage, do a lot of tanking. Look at how long it takes to kill an Adept as compared to, say, a Stalker or a Zealot. Adepts are extremely tanky, and they do so much damage to the light ground units. Now, that's about... I'm gonna pull out here, stop for a second, and just explain where this game goes from here. After you, like, I didn't get a whole lot of damage done with those 2 Adepts because he had a wall off. I'll explain how to deal with these builds later in the episode, but for now, I want to accent that. I can get 2 Adepts out on the map, pressure the Terran, contain him on his 1 to 2 bases, just for a little while, and that's so good. That allows me to macro out back at home while also getting more units on the map. Once I get that Adept Shield upgrade, I can work on Blink, and then I can get up a strong gateway force and be able to pressure the Terran player. Now, this wasn't possible back in Heart of the Swarm. We didn't have the Adept. There was an extreme reliance on AoE damage because nothing in the Gateway army dealt with light units. If there was a large amount of small units, such as Roaches and Hydras, lots of Lings, lots of Marines and Marauders, your only options with Gateway were Zealot, Sentry, Stalker. Now, which one of those units deals very well with light units? You could argue the Zealot, but without charge, which you could not very well get early in Heart of the Swarm, you had a very hard time. And even with charge, you could get kited out extremely easily. Well, okay, I won't say that, so I won't get like any Terran bias up against me. But again, it was very easy to kite charge Zealots. So there wasn't anything to deal with the Marines, the Marauders, the Roaches, the Hydras. And that was a very big problem, and that was why you couldn't play aggressive on the map. You had to get out your Colossus, your High Templar, or some sort of big air army, because otherwise there was no dealing with those small ground units. With the Adept, though, you have a unit that can easily deal with Marines, with Lings. It can tank the Roach damage, it can deal well with Hydras. Like, it's just such a versatile unit, and it fits in so well with the Gateway Force. Mixed in with Stalkers dealing with the armored-ish units, mixed in with Zealots tanking a bit of extra damage, it just meshes so well, and it creates a strong Gateway Force. And if you start to mix in Immortals, it feels like Marine Marauder or Roach Hydra, where it's that like tight-knit, like, you don't have to have a ton of it to trade well with other units. It feels like Marine Marauder, Roach Hydra, where it's a cohesive ball of units that you can move out on the map with early, you can play aggressive with, and you don't necessarily need tier 3 units to stay even with the opposing player. But at the same time, what's so amazing about this ball is that it stays even. If they tech to T3, you need to tech to T3 as well, because Adept, Stalker, Sentry, Zealot, Immortal will not trade well with the T3 like compositions of the other players. You will not be able to trade very well with things like Broodlords, Vipers, Siege Tanks, Battle Cruisers. They have a very big weakness to the higher tier units, but if they decide to go only bio, you can trade with that. And it's not always going to be perfect trades, but you can trade with that. That wasn't an option back in Heart of the Swarm or Wings of Liberty, and that's why we saw the giant death balls of Colossus, High Templar, Stalker, Sentry, Zealot, and we don't need that anymore. There's a much bigger focus on these smaller engagements, these smaller packs of units, and you see it in this game where I'm able to get up a 2-base contain as a Protoss player without Colossus. That's a huge, huge thing. That's a huge development for Protoss players where you don't need Colossus anymore. You don't need splash damage. You don't need AoE because Adepts fill that role, and that's so, so essential. It's so important that Protoss players are able to move out on the map early, and it gets rid of that turtley 3 base, you need to get up your max Protoss ball thing. And you just don't need that anymore. If you look at this, okay, I have 5 Stalkers right now. In what situation against Terran at 5 minutes into the game, 2 base versus 2 base, do you move out with 5 Stalkers, no blink? You don't. That's suicide in any other sort of matchup. If you move out with a handful of gateway units, you just die, right? They stim in with Marine Marauder, and you just die. But I'm able to pressure the map, I'm able to keep the Terran player contained, and I'm able to keep map control. And that's so, so essential. With the new economy changes, the new essentially way that the bases work, how they all mine out significantly faster, keeping map control means I can move out, I can take my expansions a lot easier, a lot sooner, and I'm able to keep even with the other players, or even get ahead based on my own micro and my own ability to keep the map. Now, the Terran player is not playing this out very well, I would say. I don't know what this guy's ranking is in Heart of the Swarm, but he's not really making any sort of aggressive plays against me. But this isn't about necessarily how well each player played in the matchup. This is about how well this little cohesive ball works. Like, look at this tiny, tiny pack of units. In what situation, when you have this ball of units against a 2-base Terran player, would you feel comfortable moving out on the map? You simply wouldn't. And that's why we saw the 3-base plays out of Protoss, where you just turtle, is because there was no option to move out unless you had things like Blink. And now, with the early Twilight Council, with the early Robo, I have a nice cohesive ball of units. I have Adept Shields, I have Blink, I have Immortals. I can start to trade even more efficiently with things like Marines and Marauders. I can start to trade efficiently with Widow Mines. Even these Ravens aren't, like, they're a pretty big problem if I'm not microing too well. But again, it's like a micro play. You need to micro your ball well to trade against these, like, Terran packs of units. And that's such a good thing. It allows for a lot more aggressive play on the map. And this two base sort of contain is such an essential part of Protoss and Legacy of the Void, I think, because I'm able to get up a large amount of gateways, a large amount of tech. I'm able to take my 3rd base. The Terran player can even, if he does the whole siege tank drop thing, he can break the contain. There's so many different things that'll be like more dynamic with this matchup. Look, I'm even executing drops here with Adepts. Adepts are so good with drops now. If you watch, I'll just go back and forth between the bases, keeping my Adepts alive, picking off workers. Adepts are very good with the drop play, and it's so easy to transition into this with the early contain, the early robotics facility. There's so much utility out of this build because you're able to tech switch into whatever you want. It's such a good build. And I think Kiwikaki was so smart, recognizing that early 2nd gateway will allow you to do so much pressure, so much other stuff on the map. It's such a... I'm dumbfounded as to how well the Adepts have actually fixed that, like, 3-base turtle strat that Protoss had. Let me look over at chat real quick. There looks to be a few questions. That's why Terrans rely on things like drops so heavily. Direct engagements can be iffy, but exactly. As long as you're able to keep pressure on the map, harassments, that sort of thing, which is what we've seen from Terran players for such a long time now in Wings of Liberty and Heart of the Swarm. As long as you're able to keep the pressure up, you're able to continue to keep map control, to keep essentially your opponent on edge at all times, and it's such a good thing. What do you mean by the barracks thing? Can you explain that, please, Ian? Yeah, I don't know. It's just like... Oh, I know what he means. Marine Marauder is like a cohesive ball, right? Like you've got the Marauders dealing a lot of damage to armored units, and tanking a lot of damage as well. Whereas on the other end, you have Marines dealing like just an absolute ton of damage, right? Marines are some of the highest DPS in the game, especially when stimmed, and they're a very cohesive ball that you can micro and you can scoot around with and you can be aggressive with, and you can sort of trade it, and you don't need any sort of like, okay, yeah, you need medevacs, but you don't necessarily need like siege tanks. You don't need siege tanks. Those are just an additive against like certain styles. They're a very like versatile ball of units that you can use to trade against other lower tier balls of units. Once things like Mutalisks and I don't know, Infestors and Vipers start getting mixed in, you're going to see things like Widow Mines, you're going to start seeing things like Thors, but before that point, you can use Marine Marauder as a cohesive ball, a composition that works well against a lot of things, and we haven't seen that out of Protoss except with like higher tier Colossus type units. But with the Adept added in, it helps deal with the light units that we didn't necessarily have an answer for before tier 3. There was no option to move out before Colossus unless you had like incredible blink control, because it was so easy to lose your whole army against stimmed Marine Marauder. Now, you definitely could trade, and there was definitely things you could do, but without AoE or without blink and incredible force fields, it was very difficult to move out against Marine Marauder. Like, I know I'll probably get a lot of hate for that. I'm sure a lot of people don't agree, but it's simply true. Like, that's why Colossus and High Templar were such big things. That's why 3 base timings were such a huge thing. That's why the 3rd base was so important, because you had to defend until you got that big AoE advantage. There was no real moving out in the middle of the map with just a Gateway ball. Gateway does not work as well together as Marine Marauder does, and that's the big problem. That's why we saw the Turtley play. And with the addition of the Adept, we don't necessarily need to see that anymore. There's so many more options for Protoss players, and I think it's a very good thing. We're going to be moving into the next replay. The rest of that game doesn't really matter. I just kind of dropped him to death, and he didn't really handle it all that well. But I want to show off this build in PvZ as well. This build is very, very sick in PvZ, which is originally where Kiwikaki intended it. The PvT adaptation I did myself. I'm sure he used it at some point. But we're going to hop into the game here, and we'll see a very, very similar opening. We see the 13 pylon into 14 gate into 16-ish gas against a Zerg player that's going a very interesting build. We see the drone moving out here, and he scouts my base, scouts a gate expand, and then he hides the drone. We all know what this hidden drone means, don't we? Yeah, we do. Anyway, we get both of our gateways, a cybernetics core, and a pylon. Proxy hatch. Now, traditionally, this has been a problem for Protoss. If you don't scout it or you don't have a forge, there is some pretty sad ways of dealing with it. Like, you can get a zealot out and a couple of probes to help deal with that. But the major problem with that was you lose a lot of mining time, and you're potentially behind in the income and resources. In terms of like, if you've gate expanded, you're going to have a very hard time dealing with the follow-up like roach pushes. If you don't spot it in time, you're going to have a very big problem. But I noticed an interesting interaction with the Adept and a hatchery. 2 Adepts will one-shot larva. So if you hold position the Adepts where the larva will come out of the hatchery, you can actually kill the larva as it comes out. You know what that means? No units in your base. Now, okay, this may be a bit dumb, but in Legacy of the Void, it is a lot easier to proxy hatch because you can get your hatchery out so much sooner. At the same time, you can get a lot of gateway stuff out sooner as well. But it's so key that there's cool little interactions like that where you don't necessarily need to deal with the hatchery right away. you can sort of delay until you get a few more units, and then you can deal with it. You can sort of, because, okay, yeah, if the Zerg player doesn't expand behind that, he can throw on, like, a bunch of roaches, and then just run in with a roach ball, and potentially the hatchery's still there, and he has a bunch of units to back it up. But at the same time, like, I can take care of a proxy hatch and not be so scared about my life that, like, everything's terrible. I have something to deal with the early Zerglings that isn't kind of garbage. I don't need an immediate forge to start walling off and cannoning off. I can sort of get these early sort of easy, cheap units to deal with his easy, cheap units. He gets a bunch of Zerglings and I can go into Adepts, and it's such a big thing. Now, I'll explain later how as all three races to deal with this sort of build and how to scout it and that sort of thing, but that'll be in the later half of the episode. But I just want to point out that, like, Proxy Hatch isn't the scariest thing in the world anymore. Especially if you've scouted it after it's halfway done or so. It's like death in Heart of the Swarm. You see that and you're like, oh, fuck. Like, your whole life's over, right? But in Legacy, there's options to deal with it. And there's cool little unit interactions that you can use to help yourself be better against that sort of, like, early game composition, against that early sort of pressure. It's not just like, okay, I went gate expand and he went like 10 pool, I just die. No, there's options now, and that's such a good thing. There's more micro opportunity than ever, and I think that's so good. Anyway, we'll continue on with this game because it sorts out the same sort of 2-base pressure that I showed in the Terran game, but it's a little bit different now. Creep, really annoying. Can't expand onto creep, obviously. Ball. I have 3 stalkers, a sentry, and imagine if these were 2 zealots instead of 2 adepts. This would be death. He would have roaches by now, or Zergling speed, or something along those lines. And mind you, he does have Zergling speed right now, and this would be death. You'd move out to try and kill the 3rd base. You'd immediately get surrounded by Zerglings, and if you're lucky, you can excuse me, you can recall out. But right now, like, okay, this is a bad engagement. This was dumb. I don't know why I took this. But if you're playing safely and conservatively with your adepts, you can trade well with this amount of Zerglings. I'm sorry, my throat hurts a lot because I'm not used to talking quite this much. But yeah, this is a very strong, ability to be able to do this sort of thing. And this is a lot of Zerglings. This is really scary. But again, I can sort of turtle up. I can get adepts, low tier cheap units to deal with low tier cheap units. And I can sort of push this back. He's on 2 bases right now. I'm on 1 base. That sort of still follows the +1 base that Zerg normally has to have. I'm able to get these low tier units to deal with his low tier units, and that wasn't an option before. If you saw this many lings on the map and you wanted to move out, you needed Twilight Council, you needed Blink, you needed a ton of sentries. You needed upwards of 6 to 8 sentries to deal with large packs of lings. Maybe, okay, larger than this, but if he's going mass Zergling, you need a large amount of gas investment. You need maybe Colossus, but generally it's going to be a lot of sentries and a lot of stalkers. And with this ball of units, I'm safe to move out on the map. I don't necessarily have to worry so much about run bys. I don't necessarily have to worry so much about roaches just decimating my ball. There's just so much utility in this small ball of units because you can deal with the lings, because you can deal with the roaches, and it's not a perfect trade, but it does trade well. And look at this, you already have the Twilight Council, so your upgrades can come out very quickly, and you also have the utility of being able to go Dark Shrine. Dark Shrine, Twilight Council, that sort of thing helps you transition into the late game. And that transition into the late game is a bit where Protoss was lacking because you were trying to do that on 2 or 3 bases, and that was a big problem. But now you don't need to do that so early. You sort of have that option to go into a lot of different things very early on, and a lot of different things later on. You don't necessarily need that 6,000 gas investment into a bunch of Colossus and sentries to get even with the Zerg player in army, well, not even army supply, but in army value. because yeah, you can get like equal numbers of stalkers and roaches, but if you aren't blinking your stalkers, you're going to have a very hard time trading with roaches. And we see this mass ling strat that used to be so good against Protoss just not even do anything against these adepts. And I think like this is one of the major things about the transition into Legacy of the Void that I'm honestly so impressed with players like Kiwikaki about. Kiwikaki came into the game thinking like it was a new game. A lot of players I've seen have tried to transition their one gate expands or their hatch first into pool or their Reaper expands into Legacy of the Void. But with the economy changes, it's so different, and there's so many more options, so many more variables to consider. And getting that extra gateway out, look at what it does. You can contain off of two base. You can move out with small balls of units. You have an early harass option off of one base. Like that, those weren't things you could say before out of Protoss, unless you were saying, okay, he's doing an all-in. This is a 4-gate. This is 5-gate all-in. This is like one base DTs. Like, if you either said that or your Protoss wasn't doing harass damage off of one base. And, like, giving Protoss that option is just such a good thing. Now, I move on. This game transitions into, like, mutas, and I already have Blink because I have such an early Twilight Council, which, again, more options. You can get Blink earlier, you can get Charge earlier. Adept Shields is very, very good. That's almost an essential upgrade every game, I would say, is it's so good. But I'm going to end out this half. I'm going to take a 5-minute break, go and grab me a glass of water because my throat is actually getting annihilated right now. I'm going to put on some music, and then we will be back, and I will explain how, as the other races, you will try and counter, or at least, well, scout and counter this build, because there are very good ways of dealing with not only the adepts in the early game, but also the 2-base contain that follows. Anyway, I will be right back, and I will see you guys then.